Welcome to the Talking Learning and Teaching podcast. On this episode of the show, we have one of the UK's leading experts on learning and teaching. A highly experienced teacher with an international reputation, his best-selling books, which include Teaching Today and Evidence-Based Teaching, have been translated into many languages and are valued for their down-to-earth, no-nonsense practicality. As a teacher with over 28 years' experience and a former teacher trainer, he has worked as a consultant with over 500 colleges and schools, as well as several national education bodies in the UK and abroad, and speaks regularly on learning and teaching issues at conferences all over the country. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Geoff Petty to the show. Geoff, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure, Gavin.
Having you on the show, Geoff, is a real personal thrill for me because you've been a great influence on my own approach to learning and teaching. So many times when I've been reading your books, I've often thought how great it would be to talk learning and teaching with you. So it's incredible for me to get that opportunity today.
Great. Well, I'm delighted that you found the books helpful. That's wonderful.
Oh, no, they've been a fantastic source of learning and inspiration. So, Geoff, the first thing I want to ask you about is students. So how important is it for a teacher to understand their students? So understand their motives, their needs, their preferences for learning, and how can understanding students in that way help us as teachers?
Well, I think it's obviously always helpful to know about your students, especially if they've got a particular career in mind or they want to explore a particular aspect of your subject more than another aspect and so on. But I think the most important things we need to know about our students is what they know already and what they don't know already. And I was always very impressed by a system that a school actually did a lot of research on, although it's used in colleges and universities all over, which is called, I call it, Catch Them Before They Fall. And it's basically a system of tutorial monitoring with consequences. So you don't just monitor how people are doing, you then intervene with an action plan and give the students support. The idea behind that was that some students will only need to go around this sort of cycle of a review of their progress and their attendance and their marks and so on, once with their tutor once, say, every 6 weeks. And then that will result in an action plan, which they then do work on with support if they want it, if not without. And then it comes around again another 6 weeks. But what they did at Herworth School was, if a student needed more close monitoring, they would expect the cycle to go around in a week or even in a day. And so they would see some students every single day, to say, what have have you carried out your action plan? What's the difficulty? What support do you need? Do you need more support? And if the student wasn't really achieving the action plan properly, they would make sure that they got more and more and more learning support, either another student to begin with, but later on it would be professional learning support. And this improved the number of students getting 5 good GCSEs in the school from about 38%, which is sort of hovering on special measures, up to over 90%. And there was no change in the catchment area or any other sort of factors. And they weren't doing special GCSEs, that were easy or anything like that. It was just this meticulous monitoring. It did take them 10 years, but it was phenomenally powerful. But that really shows what happens when you really, really know your students and their weaknesses and you're addressing them. So that, I think, is the most powerful thing. But obviously, any knowledge about your students is helpful. But the most important is what they can't do and what we're going to do about it. It's that sort of cycle of improvement.
So I think that leads quite nicely into the next question, really. I mean, that was a fascinating insight that you provided there, very much evidence-based if they got such a fantastic enhancement in their GCSE scores. But I want to talk to you now about differentiation. So when I'm working with my trainee teachers in higher education, it can sometimes be quite challenging for them to understand the idea of differentiation. So I mean, for example, for many years, higher education has largely conformed to a one-size-fits-all approach to learning and teaching, kind of the classic lecture seminar approach. I mean, how important is differentiation in the classroom, and what would you say the best way to do it is?
Yeah, I was rather dismayed when differentiation first came out as an idea, because the solution that was suggested was that, we needed to do 4 different lesson plans, one for the visual learners, one for the verbal learners, or one for the weak learners, and one for the middle learners, and one for the more able learners. And we'd have different objectives, we'd have different materials, we'd have different resources, different activities in the classroom. And it's a near impossibility to actually do that in practice, because you really need 3 different teachers or 4 different teachers to do it. It's impossible, really. So right from the start, I like the idea of technically it's called differentiation by outcomes. So you give all the students the same expectations, the same work, the same objectives, the same materials, then the same tasks. But, and this is the crucial bit, and by the way, this is not just me that thinks this is the best way of doing it. Professor Dylan William and Professor John Hattie and a whole lot of others are, rounding on this idea now. So what happens is you build a ladder of tasks for any given topic that you're going to teach. I'm not talking about a lesson here. I'm talking about a topic. I think, in many ways we ought to drop sort of lesson plans or seminar plans or whatever and plan how we're going to teach a topic from introduction right the way through to the final sort of completion. And then, so for the topic, you start off with simple tasks, which would be, just recalling stuff they've been told, really, what is the definition of cash flow or whatever it would be, just basic factual sort of recall stuff. Then there'd be simple reasoning tasks. So there'd be why type questions, why is cash flow useful and when is it used or something like that, something that's a little bit more, but it's been sort of covered in the talk, and we're beginning to make them sort of reason with the information rather than just regurgitate it. And then you end up with, say, maybe a case study, of where cash flow went wrong in a business, and you say, well, what went wrong in this particular context with this particular business? Why did it crash, despite having so many orders on its books and and the students now have got, you give them open, challenging questions. So they're not closed questions like, what was their system of cash flow? Yeah, where they're just purely descriptive, low order, but instead it's a high order and it's an open task. So it could be a PhD, could be a book, could be one side of A4, could be a sentence, So, and in that way you differentiate, because some students will, get up to the top of the ladder in this particular topic in plenty of time, to give this task real thought. And even if they say they've finished it, you can say, well, hang on, you've only considered this and that aspect of cash flow. What about so and so? You could write a bit about that too, or think a bit about that too. Whereas the weaker learner will just get up to this sort of challenging open task and maybe only be able to work on it for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or much less time than the more able. So this idea of a ladder of tasks that goes from, if you like, surface to deep learning, and then to transfer, ideally. If you know about sort of John Biggs's approach, he's very keen on that approach of surface, deep, and transfer, and so is John Hattie. But to state it in a simpler way, reproduction tasks where you just repeat stuff you've been told, simple reasoning tasks which are beginning to ask deeper questions that make the student think about the content you've given them, followed by really challenging opening tasks that really make them think hard and reason with the information you've given them in a really deep and meaningful way, and maybe transfer it as well. Where else could cash flow help? Rather than just in this particular context of the case study. So I think that form of differentiation is much more manageable because everybody's learning the same basic stuff, doing the same basic ladder of tasks. But it does require the thought and the management of, topic planning for it to be successful. quite a bit of planning and thought.
That segues really nicely into the next question, because I've read plenty of your books, as I mentioned, and one thing that I always remember from them is this idea around climbing Bloom's taxonomy like a ladder. So going from the sort of lower order tasks to the higher order tasks, from surface to deep, etc. I mean, in higher education, we use Bloom's taxonomy quite a lot to create learning outcomes, etc. And specifically, the higher order skills are the ones that we often want our students to develop, because it's obviously higher education. However, lots of the students quite often struggle with mastering those higher order skills. What, in your view, is the most effective way for a student to learn those higher order skills in Bloom's taxonomy, Geoff?
Well, I think I've learned an enormous amount from Ruben Feuerstein, who actually taught people with learning difficulties, and including adults with learning difficulties. And so I have to say, when I first started reading his stuff, I thought, well, this won't be very relevant to most of my teaching because this is special education, you know. But I was stunned by one strategy that he used, and I call it double-decker lessons. And basically, you isolate the skills which you know your students are going to need, either because it's in the nature of your subject. You know, if they're being taught IT, they'll need perhaps to negotiate a brief with a customer. You know, say. I mean, I'm not an IT teacher, so that might be silly, but you know, you get the drift. There are certain things that a certain subject specialist should be able to do, and also maybe there's special things in the assessments. You know, maybe there's always a comprehension question in the assessments, in which case they need to be good at reading a piece of text they've never seen before, comprehending it, asking questions on it, whatever. John Biggs calls this constructive alignment. And it's an immensely powerful idea, and it's sort of obvious, but we don't do it often, because when you look at the curriculum that most people and the schemes of work that most people use, it's got the content in there in terms of knowledge and comprehension of that knowledge and so on, but it hasn't very often got the high order skills. So it hasn't got evaluative thinking or writing skills or negotiating a brief with a customer or whatever whatever those things don't appear, and you just sort of assume they'll pick them up, you know, and of course they don't, because these are hard skills. So the solution is, I think, double-decker lessons, and the way this works is this. You have a look at the skills and you identify them. That's a real job in itself. And I think many teachers will take a whole career to get that right. It really is hard to know what the skills should be. But once you've decided what they are, then you say, okay, let's look at the scheme of work, you know, what I'm going to teach when, over a period of a year or a term or whatever you've got. And let's see where I can make the students use these skills in order to learn the content. So let's say being able to read a journal article, close read it, get an understanding from it, is a really important skill that you think because you're a psychology lecturer or whatever, and you think that's really important, that they should be able to do that. So you say, okay, well, we're going to teach them, motivation theory, on week 17. Why don't we give them a journal article about motivation theory? Yeah. And it could be one I write specially and make up, or it could be a real one. And we'll get them to learn it from that. But we won't just give them the journal article because they'll struggle and fall over. We'll tell them how to go about reading a journal article, and we'll give them the skills. We'll break down how you would close read something, underlining the key points, highlighting it maybe, summarizing it in a mind map, or with a set of key points or whatever at the end, finding a sentence you don't understand, reading it again. If you still don't understand it, carry on, get to the end, go back to the beginning, read it through, and then see if you understand it next time. If you still don't, go and ask somebody. All these obvious things which everybody who knows how to do this thinks is obvious. The students don't know. They just think, oh, well, I didn't understand that sentence, I must be stupid, and they stop, whereas you and I would say, I don't understand that sentence, I'll read it all again, I'll read it to the end and then read it, and then read it 3 or 4 times, and then maybe it'll make sense tomorrow. And if it doesn't, I'll ring up John, and John, what does this mean? So we have that persistence, those series of strategies. We know what to do when we don't know what to do, if you know what I mean. And we need to structure, that process, give it to the students, and then we get them to learn motivation, this content, by close reading. And then at the end, here comes the really clever bit from Feuerstein. He says they will forget about the skill. They'll remember the content if you just do that. What you've got to do at the very, very end is you've got to say, we just read a journal article. What did we do? And why did we do it that way? What did we do first? And then, maybe the first thing you tell them to do is to read the title, think what it might mean, read the abstract, maybe look at the diagrams and the graphs if there are any, maybe read the first paragraph of each section and the last paragraph of each section, get a feel for what it's all about, then go back and really start reading it. And then you say to students, what do we do first? And they'll probably say something other than that. We underlined. No, well, that's not the first thing we did. What was the first thing we did? Oh, yeah, we read the abstract. Why? Because that journal article may not be useful to us. It may be, we may be going to reject it and read another one instead. We need to know roughly what it's about before we start reading it. Then we started underlining. Why did we underline? What would have happened if we hadn't have underlined? And you step them through this process and you say, why did we do it? What would have happened if we hadn't have done it? You step through the skills sequence. Not all skills can be broken down into an entirely logical sequence, but most certainly can be broken down to an extent. And then the students reflect on how well they've done this close reading, set themselves targets for the next time they do some close reading. And then 3, 4, 5 weeks later, they're learning another piece of content by close reading. And they review the targets they set themselves. Oh, I wasn't very good at reading the abstract really closely first. Yeah, or whatever. So everybody then has got their own little target for close reading the second time they try it, the third time they try it. And so what happens then is you're learning content in a brilliant way because they're close reading, which is a very powerful way to learn. So they're learning the content well, and they're learning the skill well, because the only way of learning a skill is to do it and to get feedback on it and to set yourself targets for improving it. So you've covered the skill and the content at the same time. So it doesn't take any longer. You're still teaching the content in about the same amount of time than if you taught it in a more direct way.
So the double-decker. Yeah, sorry, Geoff. Yeah, so the double-decker lesson is a top tip, I guess, then in relation to developing those skills.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really powerful approach. As I say, it comes from Feuerstein, and basically it's the idea of the bottom of the double-decker lesson is the content, the top is the skill. You're using the skill on the content, you're learning the content because they're thinking hard with it, because the skill requires them to, and they're learning the skill because they're practicing it. But you're setting targets for the next time they use the skill, because the skill is too hard to learn in one shot. You might, if you really want to develop the skill of close reading, you might want to do it 4 times, 5 times during a year, maybe 45 times. And some students will need longer than others, obviously.
So you mentioned previously constructive alignment. And from reading your works, you obviously feel that constructivism is a very persuasive theory of learning. Why is it so important that we get learners to form constructs when we teach them?
Well, it's the idea of I'm beginning now to call it co-constructivism, because I think people can get confused with the 1960s version of constructivism, which was where you said the teachers shouldn't teach kids anything; they should all work it out for themselves, which surprisingly didn't work. There we are. So what we're doing is we're getting the students to form an understanding, and it's the teachers involved as well as the students, and they're working together. So both the teacher and the student, constructivism, forming a construct. Now, when somebody learns, they form an understanding of their own personal version of what they've learned, and they form it by interconnecting neurons, brain cells. And there's no pen and paper in there. There's no tape recorder in there. All of the learning is a construct. So it's, whether you like it or not, if a student has learned, they've got a construct. If they haven't learned, they haven't. So whatever your theory of teaching, we all believe in the theory of constructivism, that this idea that the student forms their own meaning. And everybody who studies the brain or the mind, philosophers or brain surgeons or, neurophysiologists or educationalists or sociologists or anybody who studies the brain or the mind, they all agree. They all agree that each individual is forming their own understanding of what you're teaching them. So we are really forced as teachers into accepting this because it's just a neurological fact. And so the question becomes, how do we ensure that the students actually form these constructs, and knowing that they made them, and therefore there's going to be errors, there are going to be omissions in this construct, in this version of what they've learned. This version of what you've taught them is going to be incorrect in that student's head. It's going to be incomplete. It's not going to be linked to all the things it is linked to in your brain. But as the teacher, they won't have that depth of relational thought that you will have. So we know they're going to get it wrong. And so the teaching process is get the student to form a construct. Unfortunately, we can't see it. So we have to get them to express their understanding by answering a question or writing something or, doing a task of some kind. And then we can use that task outcome, that writing, that problem solving or whatever they did, as a window into their head, a window into their construct to see whether the students have got it or not, and that will then provide feedback. That's not exactly how cash flow works. So you really got to consider so and so as well. So then if the student then gets that feedback somehow, they can then improve their understanding, improve their construct, and it is inevitably a trial and error process of developing. And I think I'm still developing my constructs for the things I teach and have taught for decades. I'm sure you are as well. Learning process is lifelong. So, it's not surprising students need to go through this cycle of expressing their understanding, getting some form of feedback, and then improving it.
Again, I mean, that was a fascinating answer, and it links quite nicely to the next question. So you mentioned this kind of co-constructivism aspect previously, and the next question relates to sort of how learners can potentially teach themselves with our support. So, I mean, how important do you think it is that learners learn how to learn in the most effective way for themselves?
Well, I think it's absolutely vital, and because I know some people who have not picked that up, and I think it has helped. It sort of holds you back. And I think an awful lot of people who are very successful in life, whether they're academics or not, are people who are analytical about what's just happened, and they think, it would have been better if I've done it like X. And this sort of reflective, sort of improvement of their understanding is really basic to running a good business or a career of any form or sort. Reflective practice, we call it as teachers, don't we, for ourselves? So it's absolutely vital that people can teach themselves and reflect and metacognition. You'll know Professor John Hattie, who's collected together all of the meta studies, all of these studies on things to do with teaching and learning, and particularly to do with attainment of students, to try and find the factors that have the biggest effect on students' achievement. And he finds, not surprisingly, that metacognition, thinking about your own learning, is immensely powerful. It has a big impact. If you require your students to think about their thinking, think about their learning, think what they need to do next, check their own learning and so on, it has an immensely powerful effect on their attainment. So, I mean, it's just practical, really, that we need to teach that. We need to teach our students to be reflective practitioners in their own learning processes. Yeah. I mean, just one very simple thing, when my A-level students, I used to teach A-level physics, they start, and I noticed very early on in my career, they weren't very good at doing little tests. And I more or less told them what was in the bloody test, sort of, and then they come up and they get 3 out of 10, and they say, "Oh, I thought I knew that," and I said, "Well, how did you revise?" And they said, "Well, I read my notes." And of course, immediately I realized there was no corrective practice of their ability to recall their notes. So, I taught them, what you do is you read your notes, then you close them, then you try and write down everything you can remember. Then you open your notes again and you check whether what you've written everything down and whether what you've written down is right against your notes. And then you notice what needs to be improved. Then you go away and have a cup of tea, and then you sit down, you do the same again. And preferably on another day, actually. And just that very simple, correcting their recall had a huge impact on their capacity to pass tests, And of course, when you say it to them, they think, "Oh, yeah." But there's an awful lot of things that we don't teach our students. We just sort of assume that they've got these skills or that they'll learn them for themselves. And we've often learned, most people who are teachers are successful academically. We've learned the skills by osmosis or picked it up by accident. That doesn't mean all our students have got those. We need to teach them directly, I think.
No, I think you make a really important point there, Geoff. I think we do often assume, particularly in higher education, that the students will just sort of pick it up through some process of osmosis. And I think for many of them that enter into higher education, they probably don't know the most effective way for them to learn and develop various cognitive skills, etc. So I think that's a really important point. And just obviously touching upon that text you mentioned there by John Hattie, that's visible learning, isn't it? Where he looks at all the activities with the highest impacts and effect sizes, doesn't he, on student attainment, which is a really, really important text, obviously, for anybody involved in learning and teaching. So that was a good plug there for that particular book.
He's just about to bring out a new. He's going to call it. It's not a second edition. But it's a follow-on book, and he's very kindly sent me 3 chapters to read through to suggest improvements and things he hasn't made things quite clear enough. So I've been looking at that, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant work. It's fantastic work because it's so, it's real helicopter looking down from 30,000 feet, on the whole, on every aspect of teaching and learning, and picking out the things that have the really big impact on students' achievement. It's fantastically powerful work. Really, really useful.
Well, that's great. That's hot off the press. I mean, that's something for us all to really look forward to. Again, from reading your books, Geoff, you've often discussed the need for feedback-corrected practice when we're teaching students. So just how important is feedback to effective learning, and why is it so important? And, do we need to be giving feedback to students even when we're not assessing them? Because one of the kind of issues we often have in higher education is that feedback tends to be limited to the assessment process, but not necessarily to the learning process.
Yeah, that's an extraordinarily good question, Kevin. And I think it's really important to distinguish because, formative assessment, as they call it, assessment when the students are forming their ideas and forming their learning and beginning to learn a topic, is incredibly powerful. It's one of the things that both cognitive science and also John Hattie's work, and it's immensely powerful. But I think there's a tendency to think, because of the word, I think actually people tend to think it's what a teacher writes on a student's work or says to this student directly, perhaps verbally, but it's not. If you know about how thermostats and boilers work, feedback is just information about how, what's the effect of the boiler. Is the room too hot, too cold? Switch the boiler on, switch the boiler off. There's a feedback loop from the thermostat back to the boiler. And in exactly the same way, there needs to be a feedback loop to the student about whether they've succeeded or not. Now, here's a very simple thing that, is really powerful. You get the students to summarize something that you've just taught in a mind map or a graphic organizer, as they're called, of some sort. flow diagram, for example. Anyway, so you say, okay, we talked about the cash flow process. I want you now on a big sheet of A3 paper to draw a diagram of the cash flow process in your, or whatever. So they do that. And then when they're nearly all finished, you say, okay, leave your diagram behind, get up. This is in a seminar, obviously. Get up, have a look at everybody else's. Have they thought of something you've forgotten about? Have they expressed something in a clearer way? So you're looking at other people's work in order to steal ideas and improve your own. So they all get up, they have a look at everybody else's diagrams, and they go back to their desk and they think, oh yeah, I really like John's way of explaining that, and oh, I forgot so-and-so. And they produce their mind map of how cash flow works, or their flow diagram, or whatever it is of how cash flow works. And then you say, okay, now here are 10 key points, which I think should be on your diagram. Have you got them? And you just stick them on the screen, and they self-assess against those 10 key points. Oh, I haven't got number 3. And then they improve their diagram. And of course, they're also improving their construct. Now, if you think about that lesson, they're getting feedback, from themselves when they're drawing the diagram. Oh, I need to mention so-and-so as well. So they're feedbacking to themselves. They get up and have a look at everybody else's diagrams, and they're saying, oh yeah, I forgot about such and such, and oh, well, that's a good way of explaining it. That's feedback as well. Teacher could be reading the Guardian, with his feet up on the front desk. Hopefully they're not. Of course, could be the Times, but anyway, hopefully they're not. Hopefully they're wandering around looking and learning from the diagrams. But the student is getting feedback by looking at everybody else's work. Then you put your 10 key points up, and they go through those, and they think, oh, I haven't got number 3. More feedback. You've hardly opened your mouth, but the feedback's gone there. The thermostat is telling the boiler, this isn't right yet. This isn't right yet. This isn't right yet. And the improvement in the construct, which is what we were talking about before, is taking place all through that process. And the students might even talk to each other. Why did you put that there? Shouldn't it be over here? No, it should be over there on your diagram. Why? There's all this feedback going on during the discussions while they're looking at each other's diagrams, maybe as well. So, feedback doesn't have to be you writing a note on the student's final essay on a topic or a course or whatever. There's a lot more to it than that, and it's far more powerful while the student's learning than after they've completed the final assessment. After that, it's too late, pretty much. Well, not completely too late, but, why can't we give them that high quality feedback right during the process of the learning? That's when it has the biggest impact. And it has a massive effect size then as well, as Hattie's, found, if it's done well, if it's informative, if it says what's good about the work, and also this is how to improve it, if it's informative in that way. Interestingly, grades and marks, 7 out of 10, 70%, don't work. That as a form of feedback, they're really pretty inadequate, because it seems that the weaker learner just goes into despair if they get a low grade and think, oh, I'm no good at this. And the more able student who gets a good grade thinks, oh, I don't need to improve. I got a B. What they need instead is, this is what you got right. This is what you need to improve. So if you strip the grading away and the comparisons between students away as much as possible, and focus on, this is what you got right, this is what you need to work on, massive improvements can be developed while the student's learning that topic.
So, I really like that approach. Quite often when I'm supporting my trainee teachers, I often refer to it almost as the sort of holy trinity of feedback. Within a given teaching session, a learner can receive feedback from the teacher, they can receive it from their peers, but they can also get self-feedback, as you mentioned there, which I think is really, really important. Mm-hmm. I want to take us back to, it takes us back a little bit, actually, to the double-decker lessons idea. Mm. And it's kind of a unique slant on that. So, if it's important for us, for students to practice skills in class, to learn them effectively, one of the kind of complaints that I often get working in higher education is that teachers often tell me that they don't have the time to both teach content as well as set activities that get students practicing skills within a given teaching session. If it's in the confines of an hour's lecture, they find it quite difficult to do both at the same time. What would your advice be in response to that, Geoff?
Well, I think the skills are, if anything, more important than the content, because the skills are transferable, you know? I mean, if you know how to read a journal article, close read it and really understand it, you know, even if you're not going to become an academic and you're going to go and, you know, become a structural engineer or something, it's still incredibly powerful, you know, to be able to read something closely and really understand it and to check your understanding. You know, it's a life skill we're giving there. Whereas if you're teaching them, you know, about bending moments or something or some particular topic, they may never use that again in their entire lives, but they will reuse the journal article with close reading. You know, even if it's reading a leaflet about some medication they're on. You know, I mean, it's so. I think it's a big mistake to focus solely on the content and to ignore the skills. You know, if you're going to do anything, do it the other way around. Teach the skills and ignore the content. Well, that would be stupid. But the double-decker lesson, it seems to me, is the solution, because you're teaching them both at the same time. You're getting a double hit. It's a win-win situation for both content learning and skill learning, because the best way of teaching content is to think hard about it. And the skills require the student to, you know, the skill of, say, close reading would require, or evaluating or problem solving would all require them to think hard about the content. So it's a great way to learn the content. You're making them think hard about it. And it's a great way to learn the skill, because you're learning it in real life. You're actually practicing the skill. You're really, really reading a journal article. Yeah, for a very good reason. I need to know this, because this is what this lesson is about. It's not a exercise, you know, it's for real. So you're getting that lesson does two things. It learns which we described earlier, where the students are learning some content by reading a journal article in a meticulous and careful and close reading way which is determined by the lecturer. So the lecturer gets the students to read in the way they think they should be able to read. That teaches both the things at the same time, so it doesn't take more time. You know, there's no extra time, hardly any extra time to teach the skill at all. The only extra time is when you say to them, "You've just done some close reading. How did you do it? Why did you do it that way? And what would happen if you'd missed that step out?" 3 minutes, 1 minute, you know, at the end of the lesson, you're losing no time at all, and you're getting brilliant content teaching. Yeah, it's a win-win.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like an effective solution, doesn't it? Because I think quite frequently what we've done in higher education is kind of teach the content, and then the expectation is that the students will pick the skills up for themselves during self-directed study. But obviously we've got no real way of knowing if they're practicing them effectively, and they're not necessarily getting that feedback that we mentioned, are they, when they're off on their own trying to kind of wrestle with the skills that relate to that content. So I think the double-decker lesson is a really good thing to explore, really.
Yeah, it is very difficult, though, because, you know, nobody taught me to evaluate. And I don't suppose anybody taught you to evaluate. Most of us, you know, we've sort of picked it up. But the consequence of that is a lot of people can't evaluate, you know. I mean, for example, one aspect of evaluation that's been pointed out to me is that you can't just say, well, what are its strengths and what are its weaknesses? Because first of all, you've got to say, what's it there for? So you need a purpose, yeah? Given that purpose, what are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And there's still another step, which is, what are the alternatives? Because something could meet its purpose perfectly, yeah? And have just a few disadvantages. So lots of strengths, not many weaknesses. And you say, great, well, we'll do it. But there might be another strategy that's got even more strengths and even less weaknesses, which would do it better. So you need, what is the purpose of it? What are its strengths in terms of that purpose? What are its weaknesses in terms of that purpose? And what are the alternatives? And is this one the best alternative? So that's really, and one of the brilliant questions that Feuerstein poses to his students when he's teaching them a skill is he says, well, where else could you use that process? Because a lot of, you know, if you've got students to say, evaluate care plans, because you're a social, you're teaching students to become social workers or something. So you're looking at care plans for elderly people or something like that, say. And and you could teach them the content by talking at them about what's in the care plans. And you know lots about care plans, and you could talk easily for an hour and a half on it, right? But better say, here's a context, a certain person, a case study. Here are four different care plans for this person. Evaluate them. Yeah. And that's a double-decker lesson now, because we're going to learn evaluation. We're going to learn care plans. But you've got to tell the students at the beginning, this is the purpose of a care plan. You know, to what extent do these care plans meet that purpose? To what extent do they not? And what alternative care plan would be better? And then when the students have all done that, they think the lessons about care plans, and then you say, you've just done an evaluation. Where else could, you know, and then you say, how do we do it? Why do we do it that way? What would have happened if we hadn't done it that way? And then the most brilliant question, Feuerstein question, is, and where else could we use that process? Purpose, strengths, weaknesses, alternatives. Where else could we use that process? And after a bit, the students begin to think, bloody hell, I could evaluate anything with that. You know, I could evaluate my guitar. I could evaluate my, you know, anything. I could evaluate my girlfriend. You know, that might be a bad idea, but you could evaluate anything with that. And once the students have got that, and then you can say to them, you know, maybe 3 lessons later, you say, okay, we're going to do some evaluation again, but this time it's not to learn about care plans, it's to learn about job descriptions, I'd say. But we're still, what's the purpose of a job description? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? What are the alternatives? So the students get the idea that this is the way to evaluate. And I still would strongly argue there are a lot of ministers and in governments of all forms who don't know that, who don't know about, you know, just because something has got lots of strengths and not many weaknesses, therefore we should do it, is a bad way of thinking. You've got to think what other things could be doing would maybe cheaper and more effective. You need the alternatives as well.
So again, that leads in quite nicely to the next question. I mean, you talked about evaluation there, and obviously that is a higher order skill when it comes to sort of cognition. I mean, how important is it for students to be able to evaluate their own learning and make corrections for themselves when necessary?
Well, I mean, the purpose of education is to become unnecessary, isn't it? The purpose of a teacher is to become unnecessary. You know, if a student is able to learn from themselves by, reading journal articles and books and in a close reading sort of way, and become self-sufficient, as it were, and that's wonderful. I mean, it couldn't be a greater gift, could it, really? Being able to teach yourself and become free-floating individual, doing what you want to do in the best way possible, and evaluating your progress as you go, and thinking how to change, and reflecting and thinking how to improve. So it is immensely important, I think, that we get students to evaluate their own, but they'll need your assistance as a teacher. They won't know how to do it. Why should they? And so, you know, you might need to give them skills, learning to learn skills. I mean, we mentioned one earlier where the students sort of read and then they cover up their notes and then they try and recall it and then they check and then they do it again and keep doing it until their recall is good. There's lots of other skills that you can use, you know, and to make sure that the students make sure the students are checking their own constructs and making sure that they're basically sound. So learning to learn skills, I think, are really vital, really vital. When I was teaching A-level physics, we had our hours cut for how many hours we were allowed to teach them in a week. I thought, bloody hell, there's just no way I can fit all this stuff in, you know. So I thought, well, there's some stuff I'm teaching, which is really, really basic factual stuff, like what is an alpha particle, what is a beta particle. You know, I mean, it's really just, you know, they can learn from a book as well as listening to me, probably better. But then there's other stuff like field theory, which they, you know, fries their brains and they just can't get it. And I wanted more time on those topics. So what I did was I did independent learning, which is, you know, basically I set them an assignment. I said, this is what you need to learn. You know, what is an alpha particle? What is a beta particle? There's going to be a test on it. Yeah. I'm not going to teach it. They looked a bit puzzled. I'm not going to teach it, but you've got to learn it. And you've got to keep taking the test until you get, you know, 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, sort of on this very straightforward factual test on alpha particles and beta particles. And then I used learning teams. I put them together in groups of about 5 or 6. And I said, you're all responsible for each other's performance on the test at the end of this. You're all going to tell each other about, what you've read and what you've understood and what you didn't understand. And you can help each other. You swap your telephone numbers and your email addresses and whatever. Set up a Facebook page and a Twitter or account or whatever, or WhatsApp group or whatever. And this is what you need to know. These are the sorts of things that are going to be in the test, just factual recall of this basic stuff. That's all you need to be able to do. Off you go, and there'll be a test in a month, and off they went. And they read up the chapter in the textbook, and they got together in their little huddles in groups in their learning teams, and they tested each other before the quiz, before the test. Simple test at the end, very short, very simple, with exactly the stuff they're expecting. What is an alpha particle? And they all did pretty well in it, and it saved me 2 weeks, of standing up spouting about alpha particles, which I could then use to teach them about field theory, which they really bloody needed the time on it, because they found it really hard. And what happened then was they were learning to learn, really, in a very simple stuff. Okay, it's just factual stuff. But they were realizing, bloody hell, you don't need a teacher. There's these things called books, and there's websites, and you can read them and close read them and underline the key points and test yourself, and then you do okay in the quiz and the test. And they loved it. They really enjoyed that teaching method, to the point where they preferred it to me teaching them, which made me quite cross, actually. When I got to the end of the course, I said, well, I was going to set an independent learning assignment on this topic, but actually we're ahead of ourselves here. We've got a bit of time, so I can teach it. And they all looked at me and their jaws dropped, and they said, well, don't you think we'd learn it better if we taught ourselves? And I thought, bloody hell, that's quite a statement, really. And so they did, actually. And we had a bit more time in class for doing past paper questions. So I get independent learning. It's in my teaching today. It's a wonderful teaching strategy, because it saves you time in the classroom to teach the hard stuff, and it teaches the students how to learn the simple stuff for themselves, and they love it. They absolutely love it.
It's really fascinating, that, because it's quite similar to an approach I've used quite a lot, which we've coined as the cheese sandwich. So basically, the cheese in the sandwich is the hard stuff. We have to actually support students to get their heads around that. But the sort of easier stuff, the stuff that requires sort of lower level skills like recall, they can do during self-directed study, and they can teach themselves effectively. So in your example there, what is an alpha particle?
Yeah.
Very, very similar. They can go off and find that for themselves. We really wanted to focus the time that we had with students on doing the really difficult stuff that they found challenging, so that they had the support of us as teachers, but also the support of their peers as well, because obviously some students would pick it up better than others, and the idea was that they could potentially support and teach each other. Right, final question for you, Geoff, and this links into sort of things like motivation, self-confidence, etc. I've had many teachers in higher education that have said to me that getting their students to experience failure in some way is a good way to help them to learn. What would your view of that be?
I think it's quite a dangerous strategy. I can imagine it being used well. For example, you could teach students to solve a certain problem using differentiation, say, or whatever in maths, say. But that there are some problems that won't work that way, and they've got to use a different strategy. They can't use differentiation, say. Yeah. So you give them one of these problems, which looks the same as the ones they've just been using differentiation to use. Then they try and do it and think, oh God, this doesn't work. And I think that's a great way of saying, aha, we've got another arrow in our quiver. We don't have to use differentiation. There is another approach that we could use. Let me show you what it is. So I think that approach is fantastic. But I don't think you should have the students floundering for long. You can make the point, what I've taught you so far, it doesn't get you far, it doesn't enable you to do these sorts of sums. you can make that point in a minute, or two, perhaps, whatever. You can do it quickly. If you set students some work to do as a homework, which, they're going to fail on, and they're going to struggle for 3 hours, they're going to be bloody cross when they come back and find that you've asked them to do something that's impossible and you knew it was impossible. So I think you've got to be very careful with it. I think it is a legitimate strategy for showing students what something can't do. And, to really understand a process or a skill, you need to know what it can do and what it can't do. You need to know when differentiation will not work for you. So that's really important. And it's a very vivid way of teaching that. But I think just beware of students who lack self-confidence, letting them fail for too long, so they begin to think, oh God, I'm stupid. Yeah, I think it's a worrying strategy. I think I would use it with caution myself, but maybe I'm too kind. I don't know.
Geoff, it's been an absolute education listening to you today. Thank you so much for joining us on the Talking, Learning and Teaching podcast.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. And if people want more information on it, because obviously we've only skimmed over these things, and when you just described to you in the way I've described, the devil's in the detail, and we didn't give the details. So there's evidence-based teaching as well, probably in your library, and there's also teaching today. So these ideas like double-decker lessons and independent learning and constructivism and formative assessment, it's all in much more detail in there, and lots of different ways of doing it.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Geoff. It's been great talking to you.
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Kevin. It's been great talking to you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.